Hey, so today I'm going to be doing another one of these duping videos since you guys really enjoyed my Jeffree Star one. I'll link the Jeffree Star Jawbreaker palette dupes video down below in case you haven't seen it. But today I'm doing a really exciting one. I came up with this idea immediately after the Jeffree Star one, and this is going to be me duping all, yes, all of them, the Natasha Denona mini palettes. If you didn't know, Natasha Denona has these small palettes. I think they're roughly about this big, and they are $25. I have my notes right here. Each pan of eyeshadow contains 0.8 grams, which the average amount of eyeshadow in a single, if you buy a single shadow, is 1.5 grams. However, in the ABH1 Renaissance palette, just for a comparison, each eyeshadow in here contains 0.7 grams. I feel like that's just something to note, so you guys kind of get how small these eyeshadows are. This is what 0.7 grams of product looks like. Yes, the pan sizes may be different, but roughly about this size if you own the ABH1 Renaissance or any ABH palette. All of them are permanent except for the Mini Tropic palette, the one that was released most recently. That one is limited edition, and yeah, I'm going to go in order from when they were released, and I went on Natasha Denona's website and I used her descriptions of the eyeshadows plus the swatch photos that she used. So yeah, let's get started. We're gonna start off with the Mini Sunset. I literally have pages and pages of notes like last time. I do want to say really quickly before we get into this, I found a very common theme. If you own the following palettes, you pretty much have all of the minis. If you own the ABH1 Renaissance or a palette that is very similar to this, if you own the Juvia's Place Masquerade palette, and especially if you own the Colourpop and Kathleen Light's Dream Street palette, if you own these three palettes, you pretty much have all of these shades. Just want to say that I know some of the shades don't look exactly the same as the product photo that I'm showing you. However, I based my dupe and comparison eyeshadows to not just the photos on Natasha Denona's website, but also photos that she has posted on Instagram of the product. And let me tell you, some of the shades look very different under natural lighting than they do in studio lighting. So, if you wonder why some of the shades don't quite look right, that's why. I'll show you different photos of each palette, obviously, so you guys can see what's true to colour. Am I making sense? I'm not too sure. To start off with the Mini Sunset palette, the first shade is Guava, which is described as a mid-toned orange matte brown. And for that I found the shade Potion in the Colourpop Dream Street palette to be very similar. The shade Apollo is a metallic red, and for that I had to go into the Colourpop Lit palette into the shade Mercy. Now for the next shade, Dirty Mars, it's described as a warm chocolate matte brown. Now I swatched every single warm matte brown eyeshadow in my collection and none of them were quite right, so I did mix two shades from the Modern Renaissance palette by ABH, but I'm fairly sure most people will have a dark chocolate matte brown. The next shade is Sunbeam, which is a metallic bronze, and for that I found the shade Casablanca in the Juvia's Place Masquerade palette to be the exact same. And finally, the shade Halo is described as a metallic pink champagne, and for that, again in the Juvia's Place Masquerade palette, I used the shade Geyser. This type of metallic pink champagne features in a couple of the palettes, but I didn't want to use the exact same eyeshadow, so I gave you different options. But if you want to just have one classic metallic pink champagne type colour, Geyser from this palette will serve you perfectly. I've actually hit pan in this shade, it's so gorgeous. Next we're moving on to the Mini Lila palette, which is the little purple palette, and the first shade is Poison Berry, which is a berry matte, and for that I found the shade Love Letter from the ABH1 Renaissance palette to be exactly the same. This shade actually also comes in a single now, so if you wanted to have that kind of deep berry matte, but you didn't want to spend the money on this entire palette, you could just get the single. Next is the shade Blue Dahlia, which is described as a duochrome blue purple. I don't actually own a shade that is a true blue metallic with a purple duochrome to it, but if you just want to get a similar effect without the duochromeness, the shade Chi from the Juvia's Place Masquerade palette is pretty similar, and I think it'll work pretty much the same, since it's kind of hard to see duochrome eyeshadows on your lid from far away, up close obviously, but from further away it's a little bit more difficult to see them. Next is the shade Raisin, which is described as a plum matte, and for that I found the single eyeshadow from Colourpop in the shade Sleeper is very similar. Next is the shade Linen, which is described as another metallic pink champagne, and instead of using Geyser, I decided to use Vermeer from the Modern Renaissance palette. This isn't as metallic as Geyser, and the last shade in this palette is called Flint, which is described as a cool-toned matte brown, also known as a taupe shade, and for that I found the shade Warm Taupe from the Modern Renaissance palette to be, again, very similar. The next Natasha Denona mini palette that I'm going to be duping is the Star palette. Now this one, spoiler alert, if you have the Dream Street palette, you literally have this entire palette. So anyway, the first shade we're going to get into is Orion, which is described as a duochrome green blue, and for this I decided to mix two shades in the Dream Street palette. I decided to mix the shades Mermaid Boy and Kaleidoscope. Mermaid Boy could work on its own, but it didn't have enough of a strong green shift, so I decided to mix a little bit of Kaleidoscope. The next shade is called Attic, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, which is a peach brown matte, and for that I found the shade Magical from the Dream Street palette to be the same. Next shade is Bellatrix, which is a metallic rose gold, and for that I found the shade Twinkle to be very similar. The next shade is Earth, which is a deep brown matte, and for that I used the shade Elfish to dupe it. So yeah, you can basically use the Dream Street palette to dupe out the mini star. However, the only shade that isn't in the Dream Street is the shade Cosmo, which is described as a metallic olive. I'm fairly sure most of us can find metallic olives in our collection, but for me, I found a metallic olive in the Smoke Sessions palette from Melt. Now we're moving on to the mini nude palette, and again, if you own the Dream Street palette, you have this one. The first shade is called Bronze Age, which is a metallic peach bronze, and I find that the shade Stardust from the Dream Street palette is very similar. Stardust and Twinkle are relatively similar, however, I find that Stardust is more peachy and bronzy, and Twinkle is more of a rose gold. Cohen is a light brown matte, and for that I found the shades Shooting Star to again be very similar. The next shade is Lamino, which is described as a soft pink champagne shimmer, and for this I found the shade Moony in the Colourpop Dream Street palette to be very similar. Moony is a satin, not really a shimmer, but I feel like it does the job. And the last two shades are from the Masquerade palette from Juvia's Place. The next shade is Sienna, which is described as a metallic pale gold, and for that I found the shade Dahlia from the Juvia's Place palette to be, again, very similar. The final shade is the shade Soil, which is described as a dark chocolate brown matte, and I found the shade Fulani from the Juvia's Place palette to be very comparable. Now we're moving on to the final Natasha Denona mini palette, and probably the most interesting one out of all of them, and I think this is the one, if I had to tell you to pick one of these up, I would say go for the Mini Tropic, because I feel like I did have to pull into a bunch of different palettes to create this one in particular. So the first shade is Mint Frost, which is a bright metallic mint, and I remember, mini story, I was doing an anti-haul last year, and I mentioned the Tropic palette, and I said if Natasha Denona came out with that bottom row as a palette, people would buy it, and she did, obviously. And I wanted to find a dupe for Mint Frost in particular, and I finally found one from Colourpop. This is the shade Heavenly, and this is such a heavenly metallic shade. It's so smooth, so gorgeous. Next is the shade Exotic, which is a bright grass metallic green, and for that I found a shade in the Melt Cosmetics Smoke Sessions palette, the shade Sweet Tooth. Next is the shade Laguna, which is a matte sky blue, and for that I found the shade Kimchi from Sugar Pill. This is a single, by the way. Going on from that, the shade Tiger Lily is a metallic deep blue. I found from the Blue Moon palette from Colourpop the shade Mad About You to be the same. By the way, I'm gonna do a 3 looks 1 palette with this soon, so keep an eye out for that. And the final shade is Xena, which is a pastel lilac matte, and for that I found the shade Lotus from Nabla to be very comparable. This is another one of those super smooth, gorgeous mattes. I really recommend Nabla's matte eyeshadow formula. And yeah, that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope this gave you a bit of inspiration to look through your eyeshadow palettes in case you were thinking about buying any of the Natasha Denona mini palettes. Let me know if you want me to do more of these duping videos, and if so, what palettes would you like me to dupe? So yeah, let me know what palettes you'd like me to dupe next. I hope you guys are having a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!